You want to know something cool? This is the 100th Trek Actually video. I mean, not really. I've done way more. There are way more in the Trek Actually playlist on my channel, but as far as proper scripted regulation, patrons and members voted on the topic, the word actually is in the title, Trek Actually videos go, this one makes 100 of those. I started this series to talk about Star Trek in ways that didn't always agree with the consensus among the fan base. Not to be contrarian for the sake of being contrarian, because Jesus, there's nothing more tedious than a nerd who's trying to out-nerd other nerds, but to look at this show that we presumably all love from different angles, a little more deeply than just here's what happened in this episode, or here's a list of ships, to challenge conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom about Star Trek. Let's not make it sound too deep, okay? Star Trek, collectively in all its many forms, is one of my favorite shows, but it's not perfect. By acknowledging the imperfections, analyzing them, making fun of them, and generally treating Star Trek like the creative work that it is rather than some holy text or historical record, we can learn things about Star Trek, about storytelling, maybe even about ourselves. Not too deep. Okay, a little deep, because we're going to acknowledge and analyze and make fun and hopefully learn something regarding one such imperfection of Star Trek in this video. This video, which I am calling, How Classic Star Trek Actually Missed the Point About Racism. One of the things about Star Trek I treasure the most is its political consciousness. When Gene Roddenberry created the show back in the 1960s, he intended for it to be a vehicle for political and social commentary. Like Rod Serling when he created The Twilight Zone at the end of the previous decade, Roddenberry wanted to use science fiction and fantasy stories to comment on hot-button issues and current events in ways that wouldn't attract the disapproval of network censors or cause viewers who disagreed with the underlying point to immediately snap off the TV. Since it was produced first and foremost for an American audience, and since it was being produced in the late 1960s, at the height of the Black Civil Rights Movement, it was only a matter of time before Star Trek turned its attention to the defining social issue of that time, and really the defining social issue of all of American history, racism. Before I talk about when and how Star Trek got its treatment of racism wrong, let's review how it got it right. Star Trek actually spoke out against racism from the very beginning, albeit indirectly. The show's cast, the command crew of the Starship Enterprise, was racially and ethnically diverse by design, consisting not only of the white or white-passing men TV viewers of the era would have expected, but also an Asian man and a black woman. The mere presence on screen of these characters made a powerful statement. George Takei as Lieutenant Sulu, barely a generation removed from World War II, during which Takei himself was among the Japanese Americans subjected to internment by the United States government. Nichelle Nichols as Lieutenant Uhura at a time when Black Americans were still campaigning for legal guarantees of basic civil rights and being subjected to violence at the hands of angry whites. Regardless of what the plot of any given episode was about, Star Trek's message was always at least implicitly anti-racist, because it sought to demonstrate not just how morally wrong, but how ignorant the racist assumptions of many Americans were. Uhura and Sulu were competent and trusted members of the team aboard the Enterprise. They were treated with respect, and their skills were frequently relied upon by the other characters. The racial and ethnic and gender diversity of the crew was presented as a strength, not a liability. The myth of white supremacy was smashed on a weekly basis. In addition to the regular appearances of Uhura and Sulu, Star Trek viewers also occasionally saw Dr. Mbenga, a black man who was part of Dr. McCoy's medical staff, and Commodore Stone in the episode Court Martial, a black man who was Captain Kirk's superior officer. None of the characters on the show ever felt the race of their fellow crew members was worth mentioning because to them, it was nothing unusual. Why would it be noteworthy to Captain Kirk or Dr. McCoy that Uhura was black or Sulu was Asian? None of the heroes on Star Trek ever assumed anyone else was less capable or less intelligent or less valuable to the team because of their skin color or their ethnic background, because they lived in the future, when people had finally evolved beyond those sorts of small-minded prejudices, at least where their fellow humans were concerned. Which is not to say that all of Star Trek's anti-racist commentary was merely implied. Of course, there are several occasions throughout the 3-season run of the original series where someone does feel the need to just come right out and say, hey, by the way, racism is bad. The first time this happens is during the Season 1 episode Balance of Terror. This classic episode, the first of several excellent homages to submarine movies in the Star Trek franchise, sees the Enterprise pursuing an elusive Romulan vessel, following a series of attacks on Federation outposts. Despite Earth having previously fought a war against Romulus, no one aboard the Enterprise has ever actually seen a Romulan before. Uhura is able to intercept a communication signal from the Romulans and display an interior visual of the enemy ship on the view screen, and it turns out Romulans look exactly like Vulcans. It's a bit of a shock to everyone. There's Spock doing his signature, oh shit, eyebrow lift, but it's an especially big deal to this asshole, Styles, who is working one of the forward stations. He has a special hatred for the Romulans because he lost family in the war. And when he sees that Romulans look just like Vulcans, he just will not let it go. Which, okay, Styles, dude, I'm sorry your great-grandparents or whoever died in the Romulan War, but this episode establishes that as happening in the previous century. So maybe get over it? You didn't even know him. That's like if one of my great-grandparents was killed in the Pacific Theater in World War II, so every time I see a Japanese person, I go out of my way to be a dick to them. Actually, no, it's even worse than that. Because after he sees that Romulans look like Vulcans, Styles is a dick to Spock, which would be like one of my great-grandparents getting killed in the Pacific Theater in World War II, so every time I see a Korean person, I'm a dick to them. Because I'm such a dipshit, I can't even be racist against the right group. And it's also foolish on another level, even apart from being racist. Spock is the first officer of the ship, and therefore Styles' boss. And Spock's best friend is Kirk, who is the captain of the ship, and even more Styles' boss. Go ahead, be a racist shithead to your boss and your other boss, you racist shithead. What happens is, they get a look at the Romulans, and then Kirk asks about the status of decoding the signal they're intercepting, and Styles goes, let Spock do it, implying that Spock would know how to decode the Romulan signals because Spock is a Vulcan and Vulcans look like Romulans, and of course also implying that Spock can't be trusted because he looks like the enemy. So Captain Kirk turns to Styles like, what was that, motherfucker? And Styles, who like all racists is a coward who goes to pieces as soon as his racist bullshit is challenged even slightly, says, nothing, sir. But Kirk keeps on him, says, no, go on, what did you say? And Styles says, I was just saying Spock could probably decode the Romulan signal for you. And Kirk says, yeah? Because of his mad cryptography skills, right? Styles is like, I'm not sure. And Kirk gets in his face and says, well, be sure of this. Leave any bigotry in your quarters. There's no room for it on the bridge. Got it? Styles is like, yes, sir. Good. Now get back to your duties as navigator, and if I catch you navigating racistly, so help me. It doesn't get much more obvious than Captain Kirk, lead protagonist of the series, calling out a racist guy on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise and telling him point blank, don't be racist. Does it? And Balance of Terror demonstrates the folly of racism in another way too. Not only does it show us that Styles is wrong to judge Spock for how he looks, it also shows us that, despite being enemies of the Federation, the Romulans themselves are more than the treacherous, murderous stereotypes they've been assumed to be. Eventually, with the battle nearly over and the enemy ship about to be destroyed, Kirk is able to speak to his Romulan counterpart. It turns out, though circumstances beyond their control have made them adversaries, Kirk and the Romulan commander are not so different. The Romulan commander is not evil. He's honorable, trying to serve his people just as Kirk serves the Federation. When the Romulan ship explodes, the moment is presented not as a triumph, but somberly, as a senseless loss. Balance of Terror is not primarily an episode about racism. It's a suspense story with a strong message about the senselessness of war, but part of that senselessness is the way we're always encouraged to vilify and dehumanize our enemy in war, especially if that enemy happens to be of a race, ethnicity, or culture different than our own. Let's remember, Star Trek was produced during the Vietnam War. There were a lot of Americans who needed to be reminded that just because a group of people were on the opposing side of a war, that didn't make them less human. And just because an individual might be of the same race or ethnicity as an enemy, that didn't automatically make that individual an enemy too. So yeah, Star Trek is often right on target when it comes to racism and bigotry and prejudice more generally. The show was produced by well-meaning people who were progressive by the standards of their time, and they not only wanted to produce an entertaining TV show, they also wanted to use the platform that show provided to speak out and place themselves on the right side of history. But that doesn't mean they always hit the mark. For example, I've always been bothered by how McCoy's treatment of Spock is regarded by the rest of the crew, especially Kirk. To be clear, I love Dr. McCoy. He's maybe my favorite character on classic Star Trek, and it's made obvious throughout the series that despite their contentious relationship, McCoy and Spock do genuinely like and respect each other. But none of that changes the fact that a lot of what McCoy says to Spock, his references to Spock's ears, the color of his blood, his unemotional personality, and other things tied to his Vulcan heritage and culture, is just flat out racist. It's not as immediately offensive because Vulcans are a fictional people, but if Spock were, say, black or Jewish, and McCoy belittled him for his blackness or his Jewishness, the same way he belittles him for being Vulcan, it would obviously not be okay. It wouldn't be acceptable in a casual social situation, much less the professional, quasi-military setting of the Enterprise. These people are at work. They're on duty, in uniform. And there's the ship's surgeon calling the first officer a pointy-eared bastard in front of the captain, who just kinda chuckles at it. That's really my issue with it. Not that McCoy does it, but that Kirk seems to mostly regard it as a bit of harmless joshing between comrades. Sure, Spock gives it back to McCoy in kind, and like I said, there's a mutual respect between them, but still, when the captain of the ship, and more importantly, the lead of the show, tolerates the sort of things McCoy says to Spock, that sends the message that things of that sort should be tolerated. Oh, McCoy says some pretty messed up stuff to Spock, but Spock can take care of himself, and they do seem to like each other underneath all that, so it's fine. Racist insults are acceptable as long as the person being insulted seems willing to grudgingly take them. That's not a good lesson. Captain Kirk never felt it was necessary to pull McCoy aside and say, hey man, next time you disagree with Spock, maybe try not to mention what color his blood is. What makes it even more annoying from a writer's perspective is the fact that the fundamental conflict between Spock and McCoy is not based in race, but in personality. Spock is the logical one, and McCoy is the passionate one. Let them fight about that. That's a rich and legitimate source of conflict. No need to throw some racism in as well. Again, swap out Vulcan for any actual racial or ethnic group, and the problem becomes impossible to ignore. If Spock were black and McCoy yelled at him for being unfeeling in an emotionally fraught situation, that would be fine. If McCoy then called him the N-word, that would not be fine. If Captain Kirk heard McCoy call Spock the N-word and just grinned and shook his head like, those two, that would be very, very much not fine. Something else that's always rubbed me the wrong way that falls into the category of Star Trek commenting on racism comes from the episode The Savage Curtain. That's the Space Lincoln episode. Near the end of the series, late in Season 3. The Enterprise encounters a floating Abraham Lincoln out in space. It's Star Trek. These things happen. So Captain Kirk has Space Lincoln beamed aboard. What, are they going to just leave him out there? In space? I know he's Space Lincoln, but still he's got to be cold, right? They beam Space Lincoln onto the Enterprise. Everyone's all excited to meet him. Kirk takes Lincoln to the bridge, and Lincoln sees Uhura and says, "What a charming negress." To his credit, Lincoln immediately apologizes. He says to Uhura, "Forgive me, my dear. I know in my time some used that term as a description of property." He's aware right away that what he said was offensive, so the writer had Lincoln say something racially insensitive, but then be sorry about it? There's that, at least. The real problem for me is Uhura's response. She basically waves off Lincoln's apology. She says, "Why should I object to that term, sir? You see, in our century, we've learned not to fear words. In her century, in her imaginary hundreds of years from now century, when, unlike now, racism is no longer a problem for humans." Then Lincoln says, "The foolishness of my century had me apologizing where no offense was given." Yes, the foolishness of the 19th century, where white people were always apologizing for the racist shit they said. Like, what is the point of this exchange? I believe it's well-intentioned. The next line is from Kirk, who proudly tells Lincoln that in the 23rd century they've learned to embrace their differences, to be delighted with what they are. The point, then, I think, is that because racism is no longer an issue, because humans have evolved beyond their prejudices against each other and can now truly celebrate their diversity, the occasional, unintentional, racially insensitive remark is no big deal. Uhura doesn't have to deal with the crushing weight of intolerance and inequality, so when Space Lincoln takes one look at her and immediately tosses a negress out there, she can shrug it off. Good for her. When viewed from a context in which racist intolerance and equality are still pervasive, however, this scene is a problem because it implies that conflict resulting from racist language is the responsibility of the person who heard it, rather than the person who said it. Offenses taken, never given, that self-absolving bullshit. That's a bad message for people who might say something racist, because it tells them that if someone gets upset about it, it's that other person's problem. And it's a bad message for people who might be the target of racist language, because it tells them that if they get upset about it, it's their problem. Can't they just learn to not fear words? The show's oddly high levels of tolerance for the unintentionally racist Space Lincoln and the very intentionally racist Dr. McCoy represent a couple of pretty bad misses in its handling of racism. But for me, the worst miss of all takes the form not of a recurring character trait or a single interaction within a larger context, but of an entire episode. This episode is all the more frustrating because for most of its runtime, it feels like it's going to be a bullseye. I'm talking about another episode from Star Trek's third season, the one titled, "Let That Be Your Last Battlefield." We all know this episode, I'm sure. I've talked about it before. I've had a t-shirt made referencing it, and I am wearing that t-shirt right now. It's the one where the Enterprise intercepts a stolen shuttlecraft, and when Captain Kirk goes to confront the thief, it turns out to be this guy, Lokai. He's half white and half black. Even Spock, the designated smart member of the crew, has never seen anything like him. Lokai says he's from the planet Chiron, which Kirk has heard of, but apparently is uncharted by the Federation. Lokai was in bad shape when they picked him up, but he's recuperating nicely in sickbay and being evasive in response to Kirk's questions about who he is and why he stole that shuttlecraft. One thing Lokai is adamant about, he is not a thief. He took the shuttlecraft because he needed it. Why did he need it? Lokai doesn't want to say. He's like, frankly, I'm feeling a very judgmental vibe in the room right now, and I'm pretty tired, so I'm gonna take a nap, no more questions. One thing Spock and McCoy agree on, Lokai's odd skin coloration, his half-white, half-black appearance, must be the result of a rare, random genetic mutation. Surely Lokai is one of a kind. The Enterprise was actually on kind of an important mission when they caught Lokai, so Kirk orders them back on course. But then Chekhov detects another ship approaching. The ship is small, fast, and on a collision course with the Enterprise. But instead of crashing, the other ship disintegrates, but not before dropping off a passenger. This guy, Beale. He's also from the planet Chiron. No points for guessing that. And he's come to take custody of Lokai, who is an escaped criminal. Kirk takes Beale to sickbay, and Lokai is not happy to see him. Lokai calls Beale an oppressor, an enslaver, one who brought genocide to Lokai's people. Beale, on the other hand, calls Lokai a savage, a killer, a traitor. Lokai insists that any crimes he committed were in the service of liberating people. He calls himself a revolutionary. Beale calls Lokai a plotter of ruin and a subverter of decent thought, and tells Kirk that his people tried to help Lokai's people, to educate them, but they wanted too much, too soon. They demanded utopia in a day, and violently rebelled when they didn't get it. Beale demands that he and Lokai be taken to Chiron immediately. Lokai refuses to go anywhere with Beale and demands sanctuary. Kirk refuses to take sides. Since there is no treaty between the Federation and Chiron, he tells Beale and Lokai that the only thing he can do is take them to the nearest starbase, the one Lokai swiped the shuttlecraft from, and they can each plead their cases to Starfleet Command. For now, neither Beale's request to extradite Lokai nor Lokai's request for asylum will be honored, and they'll both have to sit tight while the Enterprise carries out the very important mission it was in the middle of when these two showed up. Unfortunately for Kirk and his very important mission, Beale has magic powers, I guess. The Enterprise abruptly changes course and heads for Chiron. While the bridge crew are trying to figure out what the hell is going on, Beale walks in like, hey, I've been chasing Lokai for 50,000 years, and now that I've got him, I'm not going to just give him up to you. I have taken control of your ship through the power of my will, which is a thing I can do, and we're going to Chiron whether you like it or not. Kirk says, I do not like it. Neither does Lokai, who runs in and once again pleads for help from Kirk, declaring that his cause is just. Kirk orders security to take them both away, but it turns out that in addition to Beale's ship-controlling telekinesis, they both have force fields. Even phasers don't hurt them. So Kirk's like, okay then, if you won't let me take the Enterprise where it's supposed to go for our very important mission, I guess I'll just blow it up and kill us all. Beale thinks Kirk is bluffing, but then Kirk goes through the whole Destruct Sequence 1, Code 1, 1A bit that we see repeated in Star Trek 3, and the countdown to auto-destruct reaches 6, and Beale blinks and returns control of the ship to Kirk. Despite Beale hijacking the ship with his mind just now, Kirk decides to allow him and Lokai to remain free. Though, really, what choice does he have? Kirk tells Beale, I could put you in the brig for what you've done, but could he? And even if he could, presumably Beale's driving the ship with his will trick would work just as well from a jail cell as it would from the bridge. Anyway, Kirk tells them both to just behave themselves and stop interfering with the functioning of the ship. A bit later, we see Lokai hanging out with some of the crew, trying to explain to them that even though he seems like a hothead to them, he only acts that way because of the threat posed to him by Beale. He tells Sulu and Chekhov that they can't possibly understand because they come from Earth, a planet free from persecution. Chekhov says, well, yeah, now, but at one time there was persecution on Earth. I read about it in history class. Lokai says, if you only read about it in history class, you'll never understand what it's like to actually see people around you being despised, slaughtered, drafted into wars that serve their oppressors, and all because they look like you. Meanwhile, Beale is having a chat with Kirk and Spock, and he's saying, you know what, I'm sorry about taking control of the ship with my mind back there. You're right. Letting Starfleet Command decide all this is the right way to go. And I'm sure their solution to our problem will be a wise one. Spock's like, don't be so sure. It's entirely possible Starfleet is only going to care about settling up with Lokai over the stolen shuttlecraft. Beale says, but on Shiran he murdered thousands of people. Surely that's more important than a stolen shuttlecraft. Spock's like, yeah, but we don't know that Lokai did that, do we? Beale says, well, at least we agree upon one thing. Lokai is a criminal. No, says Kirk. We agree that Lokai took a shuttlecraft. Uhura calls in with Starfleet's answer to Beale's request to take Lokai back to Shiran. Starfleet denies the request on the grounds that no one is to be extradited without due process. There must be a hearing before Beale can be permitted to take custody of Lokai and be provided with transportation back to Shiran. Beale reacts angrily, declaring that this delay will only enable Lokai to escape once again, to gather more followers by twisting their minds with his lies. Kirk tells Beale, I can assure you, our minds will not be twisted, not by Lokai, nor by you. Just to recap, the ones who insist on extending due process to everyone, even accused violent criminals, before allowing them to be removed to another country, are the good guys, and the one who throws a tantrum over the application of due process and treats it like a threat is the bad guy. I know there's been some confusion on that point in certain quarters in recent decades. Beale says, why does there need to be a hearing? It should be obvious to anyone that Lokai is of an inferior breed. Spock's like, you mean your breed? Because I don't know if anyone has ever pointed this out before, but you all look exactly the same. And Beale's like, no, we do not. I am black on the right side. Lokai is white on the right side. All of his people are white on the right side. Duh, you clueless jackass. Spock tells Beale about the history of Vulcan, how his people once warred against each other, but eventually they found another way to live. They changed. Perhaps Beale and Lokai's people can find something similar. Beale insists that Lokai will never change. Spock suggests that the people of Shiran have already changed, since there must have been a time, long ago, no doubt, Kirk notes, when individuals were not half black and half white, but one color. Beale is skeptical of this. He says, don't you people believe you're descended from apes? Spock says, the actual theory is that all life forms evolved from the lower levels to the more advanced stages, which is basically correct and is, I think, the closest any Star Trek show has ever come to accurately describing the theory of evolution. Oh, and one more quick note. The character who scoffs at the theory of evolution because he's a racial supremacist who rejects the notion that he could possibly share ancestry with what he considers to be lower animals, he's the bad guy. The Enterprise arrives at its destination and carries out its very important mission, decontaminating a planet's atmosphere, saving millions of lives, blah, blah, blah. Then Kirk orders a course to Starbase 4, so they can settle this business with Lokai and Beale. Chekhov attempts to set the course, but he finds the navigational circuits have been burned out. Beale walks in like, I did that. I also burned out the self-destruct circuit, so you can't try that little trick again. Once again, the Enterprise is under the control of Beale, and once again, they're headed for Shiran. Beale and Lokai continue to bicker, occasionally attacking each other and both throwing accusations at Kirk, each for their own reasons. Beale because he considers Kirk and his crew a bunch of bleeding heart do-gooders who have been swayed to Lokai's cause. Lokai because he considers Kirk and his crew a bunch of cowards who talk about equality and justice but aren't willing to stand up and fight for it. Finally, the ship arrives at Shiran, where everyone is hit with the big Rod Serling twist. The entire population of the planet is dead, and it wasn't a natural disaster that did it. Spock is detecting large numbers of unburied corpses. While Beale and Lokai have been away these last 50,000 years, their people have annihilated each other. Lokai and Beale attack each other, each blaming the other for the fate of their world. Kirk pleads with them to stop fighting, to set aside their hatred for each other, to consider living in the Federation and finding peace. But that doesn't work for them. Lokai flees the bridge and Beale soon follows after him. They both run to the transporter room. First, Lokai beams down to Shiran, then Beale beams down after him. Uhura says that it doesn't make sense, to which Spock replies, to expect sense from two mentalities of such extreme viewpoints is not logical. Spock observes that for Lokai and Beale, it no longer matters which one of them is right. All they care about is their hate. Kirk orders Sulu to set course back to Starbase 4, leaving Lokai and Beale alone with their hate. The only thing they have left. So this is among the more heavy-handed political episodes ever produced by a Star Trek show. The racism is bad message lands with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer blow to the face. But you know what? I don't mind that so much. In fact, I like it. I admire it. I'm glad that a primetime network sci-fi action-adventure show in the United States in the late 1960s was willing to take its audience by the collar and scream, "Racism is bad, you motherfuckers!" right in their face. I wish more shows being made now would do that, because we could obviously do with a reminder. The problem with the episode isn't how it delivers the message or the intentions behind the message. The problem is with the message itself. Like I said before, leading into the ending, it feels like they're gonna nail it. They've got Lokai and Beale, the two guys who are half white and half black, and they hate each other, thus demonstrating the absurdity of racism. What better way could there be to illustrate how foolish and pointless racism is than to have a half-white, half-black guy who hates another half-white, half-black guy because he's got his black and white halves on the wrong sides. It's brilliant. Hokey as fuck, but brilliant. But that's not all, because for most of the episode, the hatred that Lokai feels for Beale is not presented as being of the same kind as Beale's hatred for Lokai. They don't just hate each other because their color schemes are flipped. Beale represents the dominant race of their world, and Lokai represents the persecuted race. Beale calls Lokai a criminal, but it's pretty clear that Lokai's crimes consist of acts of resistance and rebellion against a regime that brutally oppresses and exploits people like him. The episode recognizes and emphasizes that difference. Lokai tells Sulu and Chekhov that he knows how he must look to people like them, people who have never actually experienced the inequality and injustice that he has been subjected to. Meanwhile, Beale talks to Kirk and Spock about Lokai using the language of the oppressor, the same sort of language white supremacists use to talk about black people. He accuses Lokai of twisting people's minds. When he thinks Kirk and the others have taken Lokai's side, he accuses them of being bleeding hearts. Earlier, when he visits Lokai in sickbay, Beale tells Kirk that Lokai's people were savages, that Beale's people tried to educate them and civilize them, but Lokai's people repaid their kindness with ingratitude and betrayal. They even have the exact same argument about slavery that white people and black people have been having in the United States for generations. Lokai makes mention of Beale's people enslaving Lokai's people, and Beale replies, basically, slavery ended a long time ago. What are you complaining about? Yes, Lokai exhibits a vehement hatred toward Beale, but Lokai clearly hates Beale for the role he has played in enforcing the persecution and oppression of Lokai's people. Lokai hates Beale for what Beale has done. Beale, on the other hand, hates Lokai for what he is. In Beale's words, an inferior breed. Captain Kirk and Spock both recognize the differences between Lokai and Beale. Kirk doesn't like Lokai, he's suspicious of him as a revolutionary leader, and he's impatient with Lokai's demands for asylum and accusations that Kirk and the others on the Enterprise only know how to talk of justice, not to fight for it. But Kirk also refuses to turn Lokai over to Beale, and repeatedly affirms Lokai's right to due process. Kirk even corrects Beale when Beale says, at least they all agree that Lokai is a criminal. No, Kirk tells him. We agree that he took a shuttlecraft. Took a shuttlecraft, not stole a shuttlecraft. It's a subtle distinction, perhaps, but an important one, and Kirk makes it. Spock also expresses skepticism at Beale's charge that Lokai has murdered thousands of people. We do not know that he has done that, Spock reminds Beale. Spock, along with Kirk, also clearly finds it ridiculous how much importance Beale attaches to the fact that he is black on the right side while Lokai is white on the right side. Kirk tells Beale that he fails to see the significant difference between the two, but it's clear that, beyond their physical similarities, both Kirk and Spock see that Lokai and Beale are not the same. Until the ending, when Kirk and Spock and everybody else forgets. They arrive at Chiron, find it a dead planet. Spock describes it as mutual destruction. They have annihilated each other totally. His phrasing is morally neutral, as if he assumes Lokai's oppressed people and Beale's dominant people were equally responsible for the population's fate. Lokai and Beale each blame the other, understandable, but Beale's charge that Lokai's band of murderers are to blame is treated as equivalent to Lokai's charge that Beale's genocidal maniacs are to blame. Lokai and Beale beam down to their dead world to continue their struggle. Uhura comments on the senselessness of it all, and Spock says to expect sense from two mentalities of such extreme viewpoints is not logical, drawing no distinction between them or their viewpoints or the causes for which they fought. The consensus among the bridge crew, voiced by Spock, Uhura, Sulu, and finally Kirk, is that it doesn't matter who was right or wrong, that Beale and Lokai are both lost in their mutual hatred, and now that the rest of their people are gone, their hate is all they have left. The tragedy, then, is ultimately that neither Lokai nor Beale nor their peoples were able to let go of their hatred, and now that hatred has destroyed them all. Which is not a bad message, all things being equal, but in real life, and in the fictional world presented by Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, all things are not equal. The anger and hatred felt by the oppressed toward their oppressors is not the same as that which is felt by the oppressors toward the people they are oppressing. And it's pretty goddamn disappointing to see Star Trek arguing that those two things are the same, particularly as the concluding note of an episode which up until then had taken care to make it clear that those two things are definitely not the same. I don't know the specifics of the creative process that produced this episode. I don't know the original intentions of the writers or if what we see on screen represents those intentions, but judging by the episode we have, it feels like somebody lost their nerve and pulled up on the ending. Instead of a powerful allegory about the destructive effects of white supremacy, the episode becomes a watered-down fable about a generic form of racism, which we all agree is bad, right? And oh, look what happened to their planet. They killed each other because of racism. What a shame. A version of Let That Be Your Last Battlefield that held on to the courage of its convictions to the very end would have still been broad and cornball, but it also would have made it clear that Beale was a monster, that he and people like him were the original aggressors and oppressors, and that Lokai and people like him were the victims who were fighting back. And if after all this time Lokai also had blood on his hands, if he also was a monster, he was only the monster Beale had made him. But instead of specific people playing specific roles that represent specific things, Lokai and Beale are reduced to indistinguishable figures destroyed by their mutual, indistinguishable hates. It's plain oatmeal. It's cold French fries. It's stale bread. It's some other underwhelming starch. Fortunately, even underwhelming starches provide some nourishment. Stale bread can be repurposed to make French toast. That ain't bad. What is the French toast we can make from Let That Be Your Last Battlefield and other times Star Trek has missed the point about racism? Maybe it's simply the reminder that Star Trek isn't gospel, and we shouldn't treat it that way. Not in terms of its creative content, and not in terms of its moral content. It's not perfect. It was, is, and always will be the flawed product of flawed artists with good intentions who use the show to try and say things that need to be said. Sometimes Star Trek gets it wrong, or doesn't get it as right as it could have. And if Star Trek can get it wrong, so can any of us. That's okay. Getting it wrong, honestly making a mistake or overlooking something or failing to consider an important angle of an issue is okay. The important thing, particularly for those like me who are relatively privileged when it comes to the many social inequalities people have to contend with, is that we keep our minds and hearts open, keep listening, keep learning, and keep trying to get it right. Anybody else feel like French toast all of a sudden? And something for dessert, too. It's the 100th episode, after all. I've earned a little treat. Maybe a black and white cookie. While I'm waiting for my Grubhub driver, hey folks! Hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shout-outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Nadar8332. Thanks, Nadar8332. John Collins. Thanks, John. Bonnie Jesse. Thanks, Bonnie. Fourthords. Thanks, Fourthords. Geomorph Matt. Thanks, Geomorph Matt. Sirius Dinosaur. Thanks, Sirius Dinosaur. Hypatia. Thanks, Hypatia. Tanya Trummer. Thanks, Tanya. RB. Thanks, RB. Dr. Kobayashi. Thanks, Dr. Kobayashi. Chronic J. Thanks, Chronic J. Dodger24. Thanks, Dodger24. Jeffrey Pippin. Thanks, Jeffrey. Cass Fireborn. Thanks, Cass. Monty Workman. Thanks, Monty. And now, the new channel members. They are Joseph M. Thanks, Joseph. Lady Intrigue. Thanks, Lady. J2814. Thanks, J2814. Chris M. Walker. Thanks, Chris. Tapa TVD. Thanks, Tapa TVD. Brian Shepard. Thanks, Brian. The Reverend Cole Hulse. Thanks, Reverend Cole. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon, or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects, The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Amanda Billings, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana Cole and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, for next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic, and in your wisdom, those of you who are patrons and members of this channel who voted in the most recent topic poll have chosen a topic for the next video that connects back quite nicely to the topic of this video. This time, I looked at ways in which Star Trek itself as a show missed the mark. Next time, I'll look at ways in which one of the most important institutions within the fictional world of Star Trek has missed the mark. Next month's video will be called How Star Trek's Federation Actually Abandons Its Ideals. That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then, so until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching and take care, everybody.